Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Belgorod region. Today the Ukrainians continue attacking, shelling Shebekina, Nova Tavlazhanka, these settlements, and the Russians reported that as a result of artillery shelling they were casualties among civilians and 5 people were killed as a result of those attacks from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, the Russians published a video of clashes on the border between Nova Tavlazhanka and, let's say, Vovchansk, the territory under Ukrainian control. So this is the borderlands, this is the borderline. As you can see, there are a lot of places where we can see smoke. So this is that. Those were the results of artillery attacks, probably of some kind of grad or something like this. And furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians during those attacks during the previous days were using the Western weapon, just light vehicles. There were no evidence of usage like Bradley or Strikers or like Abrams or Challenger tanks, just like Humvees and light vehicles of Western countries' production like United Kingdom or United States of America. The Russians, as a result, as an answer, as an act of revenge, made another missile attack against Ukrainian positions in Vovchansk, and they reported that as a result of those attacks they hit the positions of 206th Battalion of 241st Territory Defense Brigade. This brigade used to be in the vicinity of Bakhmut, and main forces of that brigade are still located there in the vicinity of Bakhmut, and that was the brigade who was fighting in the western part of Bakhmut. But as I understand, recently that brigade was, at least the 206th Battalion was redeployed to Vovchansk for these purposes as a well-experienced forces who can not just fight but who can hold positions in case if the Russians take a decision to start a small counter-offensive operation back in this direction. Now we are going to Kupiansk front line. There were also some updates from this area, and the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in the vicinity of Lyman in these forests, the Russians managed to repel attack of Ukrainian commanders and scouts who were trying to make some recon operation in the vicinity of Lyman. Probably they were attacking, trying to push the Russians back from this bridgehead, but those attacks were repelled. The Ukrainians were defeated and they were forced to step back. The Russians continue, let's say, storming operation in the vicinity of Dvorechne. Currently they're just trying to attack and bomb the Ukrainian positions on the north of Dvorechne in this small settlement. This is their positions, what the Ukrainians are trying to keep their artillery systems, probably light mortar systems, some infantry mortar systems, and so on. For now, there are no more progress on the ground, but the Russians are very active in this area. Another interesting update that, if you remember, yesterday we discussed about the redeployment of the 4th Artillery Brigade somewhere in the vicinity of Kupiansk area, but today we got more updates from the Western sources maps that this brigade currently was redeployed in the vicinity of Lyman front line, and currently they are located behind the 25th Airborne Brigade in the vicinity of Nevskaya and Makeevka, Terny line, Zarechная line. The Russians also reported about some advances from their side in the direction of Stelmakhovka, between Kolymychiha, Kuzyomovka, Novosilovska, Stelmakhovka. In this square, the Russians continue advancing, and they were trying to develop their bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the railroad ways, and for this purposes the Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions in Krakhmalne, Berestove, Novosilovska, with one purpose, of course, we understand, just to pin down the Ukrainian forces and not to allow them to send reserves, and to not allow the Ukrainians to attack the Russians in their flank during the attack in direction of Stelmakhovka. So that was the purpose. For now, we still haven't received any results about that attack, but anyway, the sources are saying that the Russians managed to penetrate and to establish the bridgehead on this side of the railroad ways and to develop this bridgehead along the forest lines in this area. Now we're moving to the south, and we're starting there was explosions in Nevska, and probably the Russians started attacking and bombing the Ukrainian positions of 4th Artillery Brigade. Now we are going to the Siversk bridgehead. As you can see, there are a lot of icons, a lot of updates took place in that area. And the first is that the Ministry of Defense reported that they attack and hit positions and ammo depot of 67th Brigade in the settlement by the name of Serebryanka. The main location of that brigade is the northern part of Bakhmut, between railroad ways and let's say railroad ways and in the vicinity of Bogdanovka, but probably some squads of that brigade were redeployed to Serebryanka before the beginning of the Russian greatest offensive operation. So as a result of the artillery attack, that brigade lost ammo depot in the vicinity of Serebryanka. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing Siversk and continue destroying and attacking the reserves of 81st Brigade. I'll remind you that the main position of that brigade is located in the vicinity of Belgorod, where the Russians are currently trying to penetrate and to push the Ukrainian forces from that area. But for now, there are no results from those operations. As if you remember, the Russians managed to develop a bridgehead in the Serebryanka forest in the vicinity of Zolotaryevka. They managed to maintain the gray zone between Belogorovka and, let's say, Russian positions. But anyway, the Ukrainians still controls the hills in this area, and as we understand, they're not going to give up and they're not going to step back because they understand the value of this settlement. Furthermore, the Russians published more video about the attacks and artillery strikes against the, as I understand, 10th Mountain Assault Brigade in the vicinity of Sporne. Yesterday, a few videos ago, we discussed that the Russians entered the eastern outskirts of that settlement, and today, during the previous 24 hours, they continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in the western part of that settlement. So we see there are some another phase of activation, intensifying of actions from the Russian side in this area. Very interesting updates came today from the bridgehead between Razdolovka and Veselo from this area. And as you can see, the Russians reported as a result of air defense system work, they managed to shut down helicopter Mi-8. I'll remind you that helicopter Mi-8 is a universal helicopter that can do a lot of things, that can achieve a lot of objectives, and as you can see, that helicopter Mi-8 was shut down on very close to the borderline. So, and usually when there are like few cases when helicopters can be used in this situation. The first one is to support the defense forces and to attack the Russian offensive forces. The second one is for evacuation of the wounded soldiers. It's very difficult to understand what exactly the Ukrainians were doing here, but anyway, we understand that the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult if they were forced to send helicopter Mi-8 to the combat line, and that helicopter was shut down by the Russians. So as you can see, based on these arrows, we see that the Russians attacked this small salient from many sides, in direction of Serebryanka, Belogorovka. They activated in the vicinity of Sporne, and probably the Russians launched, based on the facts we received about that helicopter, the Russians launched a small offensive, or at least recon combat in direction of Razdolovka. And as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians, for example, on that front line, it's like Donetsk front line, lost 220 soldiers, but mainly most of that losses took place in the vicinity of Avdiivka and Marinka. Yes, one more time about Kupiansk and Lyman front line. As a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost 175 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. So as you can see, the level of losses has been a little bit increased, and mainly because of increase of the losses on the Kupiansk front line. Today they lost 90 soldiers on that front line. In comparison with the previous days, this is very heavy losses, and as we discussed, mainly those losses are connected with activity in the vicinity of Liman Первый, Dvorechny and Kupiansk, and in the vicinity of Krakhmalny and Stelmakhovka on this front line. Now we are going to Bakhmut, and today the Ukrainian sources published another video or another photo confirmation of the situation in the vicinity of MiG-17 statue. As if you remember, there is a small block in this area with the high-rise buildings that the Russians were using and still use for checking, establishing physical visible control over the valley between Ivanovskaya and the Russian positions in the western part of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians understand the value of that buildings, and currently they're trying to destroy them and reduce them to ruins. So as you can see, these are like on the upper photo, this is the current situation, and the photo that's like on the down, it's like the current, it's the old situation. As you can see, at least 2 buildings on the right side were destroyed, and so this situation is terrible, and the Russians also understand, and probably now they're trying to create some trenches and fortifications in this area. But if they lose these buildings, of course, they will lose some not just possibilities, I'm not talking about possibilities, they will lose some positions, very important like Reco positions that they could use for controlling the valley between Ivanovskaya and Bakhmut. This icon, some people were saying in the comments that Wagners have left Bakhmut, but there is still icon of Wagner. It's not the icon of Wagner, it's the icon of the winner of the battle and who captured Bakhmut. So we are going to add these big pictures, icons on the map showing the results of the clashes and showing the who won the battle and who was the main forces and so on. So it's just the icon shows who won the battle of Bakhmut. Now we're going further to the south, and we're going to talk about Toretsk bridgehead. The Russians reported that they continue attacking and hunting positions of 24th Mechanized Brigade in that area. So that was another hit upon the positions of that brigade, but all as usually no results on movements on the ground. Very interesting updates are coming from the, let's say, mainland, from the area in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. Today the Russians reported that as a result of air defense, they managed to shut down Su-27 in this area. And this is very interesting because, first of all, we need to understand where exactly the Ukrainians, which airport the Ukrainians could use for that attack. And probably the Ukrainians were using the Dnipro airfield for these purposes. So that Su-27s were flying in direction of, let's say, Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and somewhere in the vicinity of Pokrovsk that Su-27 was shut down. I'll remind you that Su-27 is it's a heavy destroyer. So it's a heavy destroyer according to the Russian classification of the fourth generation, and that probably, as I understand, of course, the Ukrainians could use this Su-27 from Mirgorod, but as you can see, the distance is very long, so probably this Su-27 would be destroyed somewhere in the vicinity of Lazov if the Ukrainians were using that airfield. Probably. So one more time, I think, as I understand, the Ukrainians were using Dnipro. Furthermore, today we got update that right before starting making this video, that there was explosions in the south part of Dnipro, and probably the explosions took place exactly in that Dnipro airfield that Ukrainians used at least 2 or 3 times in a row during the previous 48 hours. So as I understand, the Ukrainians managed to accumulate some air forces, aircrafts in that area, and the Russians took a decision to destroy the air units in that area. So what did happen? The Ukrainians probably, as I understand, were trying to attack the Russian Su-34M that currently are working in the vicinity of Donetsk. After the Russians restored their offensive operation in direction of Marinka and Avdiivka, the Russians intensified the usage of Su-34M aircraft to bomb these 2 settlements in Marinka and Avdiivka using the guided bombs. And Su-34M is universal aircraft. Probably some sources are saying that this aircraft can use the purposes of bomber and destroyer, and Su-27 is just a heavy destroyer. So probably the Ukrainians were trying to attack those Su-34 that were bombing Avdiivka, and as we haven't received any updates from neither Russians nor Ukrainians about destroying of Su-34, so probably the Russians managed to escape the attack of Su-27, but Su-27 on their way back was destroyed in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. So this is very heavy losses for the Ukrainians, because I'll remind you that currently the Ukrainians have at least 4 types of aircrafts like Su-24, Su-25, Su-27 and MiG-29. I'll remind you one more time that Su-24 the Ukrainians were using and still use to attack the Russian positions using Storm Shadow missiles. When talking about Su-27s, the Storm aircraft that Ukrainians use for supporting Su-24, they're using the pair attacks, Su-24 plus Su-25, and as we can see now, the Ukrainians use Su-27 for attacking the Russian Su-24. And as I remember, there were a few updates that Ukrainians managed to upgrade these Su-27s, and currently these aircrafts are able to attack the Russians using the Western missiles, air-to-air missiles. So probably the Ukrainians were planning and were trying to test a new weapon, but they couldn't do this, and their aircraft was destroyed in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. Now we're going to Avdiivka, and one more time the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings, the Ukrainians lost 220 soldiers, 10 armored vehicles, and including 1 tank. And to tell the truth, That was a very difficult day for the Ukrainians the previous 24 hours because they lost 3 tanks all over the entire Ukraine and a lot of artillery systems. The Ukraine lost around 30 vehicles, including light vehicles, trucks, tanks, armored vehicles. They lost a lot of artillery systems, including the Western one. From the Russian side, they continue attacking Avdiivka. There are still fierce fightings between Krasnogorovka and Yasinovata. We still haven't received any updates, any reports about this area. So the only thing that I understand that this entire area on this part of Avdiivka is in the gray zone, and currently the Russians are trying to establish physical control, to create trenches and to prepare the bridgehead for further offensive operation in direction of Avdiivka. Some updates are coming from Marinka as well, and one of those updates is that the Russians attacked using the Su-34M aircraft, attacked the western positions in Marinka, and the sources are saying, and very reliable sources are saying, that the Russians will, there is like 80% chance that the Russians will be able to capture Marinka in June and to complete this battle by the end of this month. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of storming operation, they managed to advance a little bit further to the west in Marinka itself, and currently they have during the previous attacks, they captured this territory. And I'll remind you that Ministry of Defense reported that the main force that took part in those attacks in the storming operation was 5th Motorized Brigade Oplot and Special Unit Akhmat, and of course 150th Motorized Division. From the Ukrainian side, there are mainly 35th Marine Brigade, 79th Air Assault Brigade, and they are supported by the squads of 1st Tank Brigade that are trying to stop the Russians. Furthermore, the Russians reported that during that day they destroyed a lot of ammo depots in this area. In the attack, the railroad station, railroad ways in Kurakhova that Ukrainians use for supporting, and they're bringing forces from Pokrovsk in this direction. Furthermore, there was explosions in the settlement Pobeda, and there were explosions in the settlement of Umansk, this area. The Russians didn't specify the brigades that lost their ammo depots, but as you can see, the Russians are very concentrated in this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported they destroyed the ammo depot of 60th Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Adradna in this area. If we take a look at the deployment map, the position of that brigade is located behind in the vicinity of Dnipro. So probably the fact that the Russians destroyed the ammo depot in Atradne probably means that Ukrainians have also already redeployed 60th Mechanized Brigade closer to the combat line. For now, we are not going to do this. We will keep this as it is. But probably soon we're going to see some updates on the Western deployments map and the Russian deployments map, and we will make changes on our map as well. When talking about South Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia area, the Ukrainians lost 145 soldiers, 15 armored vehicles, including 1 tank and 5 artillery systems. As you can see, the losses are very heavy. In this area, there were like shelling and bombing of Chervone, Takmachka. There was explosions in Kamyansk, Stepovo. From the other side, the Ukrainians made few attacks in direction of Melitopol. There were at least 2 explosions took place in that settlement, and using the Tochko U rockets, the Ukrainians attacked Berdyansk. Were trying to attack, but the Russians are saying that as a result of air defense, they managed to shut down all those missiles in that area. And one more time, I remind you that right before we start making this video, we got report that there were explosions in the south of Dnipro, and probably the explosions took place in the airfield that Ukrainians are using. So I remind that these days the Ukrainians were using airfields in Nikolaev and Dnipro, and that means that they moved to the combat line, their air forces brigades, and currently they're attacking the Russian positions. So I expect that within the next 48 hours, the Russians will launch another massive missile drone attack against these 2 airfields to destroy the Ukrainian air forces in those areas. Now we're going to talk about Kherson, and the Ukrainians lost 45 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. You can see the losses are very heavy in comparison with the previous days, so probably the Ukrainians brought more forces to this area, and probably within the next days they're going to try and make more attempts to cross Dnipro River and the vicinity of Kherson in this area, and to capture the islands that are located along Dnipro River. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.